Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the Institute and Fred, you're hosting this. I appreciate all of your coming. As I look about, some of us have been longtime friends, have been in battles on various sides, and some of you I think I haven't had the chance to meet before. I hope you'll find my remarks provocative. They're intended to be. I thought it was essential to try to place specific issues into a broader framework, because that's often missing, and often we choose up sides perhaps somewhat automatically without a discussion of what motivates and where we're coming from, because it affects where we end up. So I think the plan, Fred, is I'll talk for about a half an hour. I have written remarks that we've worked on to try to carry out what I've said. And then we're going to have some real give and take, a back and forth, and we'll sit here and you'll fire away. For weeks we've heard the same call from a host of Republicans urging immediate action on every pending free trade agreement. Ironically, they are willing to hold up the most economically significant agreement, South Korea, until they get their way on all of the FTAs. It's the same rhetoric, I think, that's been in place for years, even decades, and it reflects an outdated model of trade that fails to meet our greatest challenge in the 21st century, globalization. The 1990s saw developing countries with very different economic structures than our own get into the act. The pace of globalization, as we know, quickened and brought with it expanded opportunities and new challenges. The conventional model free trade, I put in quotes, is based on the notion that nations are at very different levels of development and have advantages that make trade more attractive. More trade will work out to be complementary and invariably better, the theory goes. And when there's competition, the automatic response will be economic activity moving to a higher level. I think globalization has challenged the very premise of this model. Now relations between economies shift very quickly indeed. What was complementary can rapidly become competitive. The basis for competition can be quite quickly altered. An economy can, in key sectors, become quickly competitive with similar products produced under very different conditions. Dominance in technologies can overcome really rapidly. Advantage can be dwindled and sometimes swindled in a short time span. Business enterprises more and more are becoming multinational, shifting operations to nations other than their original base, and sometimes competing with operations in that original base. The Clinton administration began to grapple with this new international economic dynamic. During the course of the Clinton presidency, I believe we began to see a shift in the approach from the old model to a new one. The Clinton administration negotiated, as we know, a structure for China's entry into the WTO. I was among those who felt, on balance, it was better that China joined the WTO as a step towards its acting within a rules-based structure. At the same time, it was vital that the granting of PNTR recognize that China possessed a large, different economic structure, and PNTR must contain provisions to hold China to its commitments. And I think we'd all agree what we thought of China as a different, large structure has become more and more true, perhaps beyond our expectations. As a result, I joined with Doug Bereiter to insert into PNTR several provisions to assist active enforcement of China's obligation to a rules-based system. These included an annual rather than an every 4-year review at the WTO, and a new safeguard to guard against import surges. When President Bush took office, I urged his administration to build on this progress in developing a new model of trade for the globalized economy. Instead, as I see it, they turned back the clock and returned to the old model. Their perspective was a form of trickle-down trade economics, where the assumption is that over time everything works out and adjusts. As a result, there was a strong tendency toward weak enforcement. The Bush administration allowed China to essentially nullify the effect of the provisions placed in PNTR by making a mockery of the WTO annual review and by refusing to act in 4 Section 421 cases where the ITC recommended relief to remedy harm caused by a surge of Chinese imports. Also, in a step towards a new model, the Clinton administration acknowledged the relationship between worker rights and trade and competition. They negotiated a groundbreaking textile agreement with Cambodia that included positive incentives in the form of increased market access for Cambodian products when progress was made on worker rights, and also the inclusion of worker rights in the core of the U.S.-Jordan FTA. But here again, Republicans turned back the clock and reflexively dismissed worker rights issues as social issues. We heard that incessantly. Or as an issue basically of concern to labor unions in the U.S., and thus a clash between American business and labor. But this perspective misses the fundamental roles of a country's economic development. Workers must have basic rights if they're going to improve their financial standing and climb the economic ladder. This is not only vital to individuals and their families, it is critical to reducing poverty and the development of a nation's middle class. Ironically, it is an important route, both to creating a robust domestic market and expanding trade. What's more, when we are integrating the U.S. economy with that of a developing country, it's important to our businesses, which need consumers in other countries to buy their goods and services. It's important to U.S. workers also, who should not compete with workers whose rights are suppressed who are killed in the exercise of those rights. The issue of including worker rights in trade agreements, as we know, came to a head in negotiations of CAFTA. The Bush administration had insisted in the 2002 Fast Track Law that the standard for worker rights had to be enforce your own law, no matter how out of compliance a country's laws were with international standards. During the CAFTA debate, I traveled to the region on my own, visiting Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua to get a first-hand look at conditions on the ground. It was clear that none of the countries afforded workers their basic rights, and that enforcing existing labor laws would not fix the problem. Passage of CAFTA would more likely than not lock in existing economic inequalities rampant in those countries, rather than help foster the growth of the middle class and all the benefits that are associated with such growth. CAFTA was approved in the House by 2 votes, only after the 15-minute vote was held open for over an hour. It seemed to me like it was 10 hours. A nearly united House Democratic caucus stood in opposition to CAFTA with this enforce your own law standard and illustrated our recognition that international labor standards were one of the central points in the new model we were trying to create. So when we took the majority in 2007 in the House, we insisted on changes in the labor, environmental, investment, and intellectual property sections of the pending FTAs. As a result, the Peru FTA reflected a new model for trade. On labor, FTAs include a fully enforceable commitment that FTA countries will adopt, maintain, and enforce in their laws and practice the 5 basic international labor standards, including freedom of association and right to collective bargaining. On environment, the FTAs include a fully enforceable commitment that FTA countries adopt, implement, and enforce in their laws and practices obligations under 7 common major multilateral environmental agreements. Additionally, specifically for Peru, a fully enforceable annex was drafted requiring Peru to take major steps to crack down on illegal logging devastating the Amazon. I might add something that affects not only Peru, South America, but the whole world. On investment, the FTAs include language explicitly stating that foreign investors in the U.S. will not be accorded greater substantive rights with respect to investment protections than U.S. investors in the U.S. And on medicines, and this harked back to Doha, where the most intense fight was over access to prescription medicines. It allows generics to enter the market more quickly. The data exclusivity provision in the FTAs was modified and a public health exception added. Charlie Rangel and I were pleased to travel to Peru to work with President Garcia to confirm these changes. At that time, the Peruvian president stated that the amended FTA represented, in his words, a new deal for international trade. When we completed work on the Peru FTA and announced our support for it, we made clear this did not indicate support for the Korea, Colombia, or Panama FTAs as negotiated by the Bush administration. We made that clear. Each had outstanding issues that needed to be resolved. So let me now touch on Colombia. It's clearly important to our nation. It's a major source of drugs. It has a democratically elected government in a vital part of Latin America, a region that the U.S. has far too often neglected. And under ATPA and GSP, many Colombian goods are normally exported duty-free to the U.S., while American companies face tariffs in that market. In April 2009 and again in January of this year, I went on 6-day fact-finding trips to Colombia. In over 60 meetings there, I had a chance to talk firsthand with business representatives, NGOs, workers in a wide variety of fields, as well as an array of government officials, including top Colombian leadership. These were some of the key facts. In Colombia, where violence against workers has occurred for decades, there were considerably fewer murders and less violence, but still the highest levels in the world. While there had been some progress in combating the wholesale impunity from punishment for crimes of violence, there had been limited progress even on the small number of cases that had been selected by consensus as key cases. For instance, as of July last year, only 3 of the 42 union murders in 2008 had resulted in a conviction. And as I was told just a few months ago, the new Prosecutor General, Attorney General, recently conceded in her quotes, "The administrative disarray is terrible." As reported in State Department reports and ILO findings, in laws in critical areas and decisively in practice, workers are not able to exercise their basic international rights, in particular their right to organize and bargain. Even where there's a union, under Columbia law, employers can deal directly and enter into private individual contracts. And there's been a massive expansion by employers of creating so-called associated cooperatives, leaving the vast majority of workers without a voice in their workplace. Let me just share what I heard from a few of the people I met there. I met a single mother working in the flower sector. By the way, most of those working in the flower sector in the fields of Columbia are single mothers, who had not been paid in 2 months, and her benefits had not been paid for 6 months. She works for a family that owns a number of fields, but incorporates each one separately to inhibit a worker's ability to associate and bargain. 3/4 of the flowers picked by workers in Columbia are shipped to and bought here in our country. And some of our domestic flower growers compete with Colombian companies. I met a dock worker. He brought with him a chart. It showed between him and the company, the company that operates the ship that he loads, 5 different entities, so-called cooperatives and subcontractors, used to eliminate a direct employer relationship between him and the company. Most of the ships loaded by workers in Colombian ports come to our nation. There are American companies that produce in Colombia to ship back to our nation. During my first trip, I met with 50 people who work in the sugarcane fields. Only 5 were directly employed. The rest were essentially employed through shells, so-called cooperatives, and therefore with no labor rights under Colombian law. And many were shuffled among different fields, often working longer hours than allowed under Colombian law. Colombia sugarcane is exported to the U.S., albeit in restricted amounts. For several years, we made clear, I surely did so, to the president of Colombia, then president, and to the ambassador, the trade minister, and others, the changes to its laws needed to be made to bring them into compliance with international standards. Unfortunately, very little action was taken by the Colombians during these years. What is different now, I think very different, is that the new Santos administration is expressing a determination to address conditions affecting the workers and their basic rights. Now let me say a word about Korea. Another component of a new model of trade policy is active insistence on replacing one-way trade with two-way trade. Korea has stood as one of the most closed markets to industrial goods in general and automotive in particular. The U.S. trade deficit with Korea was persistently over $10 billion, 75% or more in the auto sector. Korean manufacturers of vehicles and parts, they have completely open access to our market. But through the use of various methods, regulatory procedures, tax measures, essentially American manufacturers have been shut out. Korean companies ship 500,000 cars each year to the U.S., while we ship about 1% of that. There was nearly a total one-way street in many other industrial sectors, including refrigerators. We made clear in constant discussions with the Bush administration that a bottom line must be tight provisions that would assure the opening of the Korean market for American manufacturing. But specific ideas that we proposed were dismissed as, in quotes, industrial policy. The irony is that it was Korea that had a comprehensive industrial policy, a policy that sheltered its market so its producers could charge more without competition from the U.S. and use the profits to penetrate the American market. There were pleas from Republican colleagues and many opinion makers that the FTA should be approved because other sectors, including agriculture and services, would benefit from trade, and also that there were very important non-trade considerations, including the importance of South Korea as an ally. We acknowledged all of that. But what was at stake was best phrased in our discussions with the Obama administration. I might add they were intensive discussions. It was, I think, best expressed by Ford CEO Alan Mulally when he said that effectively addressing the problems with the U.S.-Korea FTA represented, in quotes, he said, a vital crossroads for American trade policy. The Obama administration has now acted to bring this about in the revised U.S.-Korea FTA. So here's how I see it. The trade agenda for this Congress should be broad and ensure that we go forward on the progress of a new 21st century model of trade, not backward. It should include, number one, the Andean Trade Preference Act and GSP should be freed from hostage and extended now for the rest of the session. It's inexcusable they've been permitted to expire. Instead, we should be working together to address outstanding issues, and we may want to talk about them, relating to longer-term operation of ATPA and GSP. If you want, we can even talk about sleeping bags. Number two, it's also inexcusable that trade adjustment assistance reforms have been permitted to lapse. TAA should be reinstated immediately. A 21st century trade policy must recognize that in a rapidly globalizing era, not everyone will emerge a winner from trade. By the way, going back to a meeting in the White House with President Clinton, I urged careful use of the term win-win in trade discussions. Workers, both industrial and service, will be displaced, and communities dislocated from the impact of trade. And that's why TAA is so important. Yet the TAA program is being held up in part as barter for the Colombia FTA. And because some are antagonistic to the entire program because they say it picks winners and losers. That's backwards. What TAA does is to help those who have lost because of the impact of trade become winners. 3, the Republicans have allowed their earmark ban to hold up passage of critical provisions for domestic manufacturers in the miscellaneous tariff bill, and we should act quickly to approve this legislation. Last summer, the first of 2 packages of MTB provisions passed with broad bipartisan support and was enacted into law. By the way, the House rules separate earmarks from limited trade measures. Those are separate provisions in the rules. I urge Republicans to move the second package as soon as possible. Estimates suggest that together the legislation would increase GDP by more than $3.5 billion. 4, Congress should approve the U.S.-Korea free trade agreement before Memorial Day. USTR Ambassador Ron Kirk should send the draft implementing the legislation to Congress immediately and request the House Ways and Means Committee to undertake an expeditious review and, if it wants, a voluntary mock markup. After a reasonable period for consultation, the administration, I think, should act confidently about what it's doing on trade and formally send the implementation language so that it can be introduced and fast-track procedures, including the specific timelines for consideration, started. 5, we must have a consistent and active policy towards China so that it follows the rule of law by our strengthening enforcement against unfair trade practices and responding to currency manipulation. China presents a serious challenge on at least 3 fronts that I spell out in my remarks. Let me give you one example relating to clean energy because it's so much discussed within the United States. Clean energy, wind and solar equipment manufacturing, as I said, are often described as one of the keys to the future of U.S. manufacturing. To get a competitive advantage, China discriminates against U.S. clean energy manufacturers in a variety of ways and has adopted subsidies prohibited under WTO rules. Unfortunately, resistance to increased action against that discrimination comes from those with rigid ideological objections to active domestic government-private sector partnerships on the development of clean energy manufacturing. China's discrimination was the subject, as you know, I think, of a recent Section 301 petition. I was pleased that USTR filed a WTO case based on one aspect of that petition, but I was disappointed that the administration was unable to complete its investigation on many of the remaining claims. We need to direct increased funds to USTR to ensure that it has the tools it needs to investigate and prosecute WTO violations, as well as the negotiation and enforcement of overall rules for fair trade. Finally, this institute, I say this everywhere, not only when Fred Bergston is in attendance. Finally, this institute and Dr. Bergston have spoken eloquently about the need to address currency manipulation. Last year, we acted on a broad bipartisan basis in the House to approve WTO consistent legislation, I emphasize that, WTO consistent legislation to address China's currency manipulation. The administration must be much bolder. China's currency devaluation cost U.S. businesses, it's estimated, $125 billion in net exports. The House Republicans' decision that currency issues are not a top priority reflects an allegiance to an outdated model that international trade issues will work themselves out over time without much damage. 6, we must seize the opportunity presented by the Santos administration to assure concrete, lasting changes to the conditions in Colombia so that as trade is expanded, it expands those who receive its benefits. I just want to repeat that because it's part of so much of what I believe. As trade is expanded, it expands those who receive its benefits. The Obama and Santos administrations are now actively discussing concrete steps to address and resolve long-standing issues relating to worker rights in law and in practice, and to violence and impunity. It is vital that they work expeditiously to implement these important components of trade policy for the globalizing 21st century. As Ambassador Kirk said in his testimony before the Ways and Means Committee, and I quote, "Any timetable will be contingent on the successful resolution of these issues." 7, let me say a word about Panama, which I've been involved with now, these issues for 4 years. If Republicans had succeeded, Panama would still be an unchallenged tax haven. But the Obama administration has worked to conclude talks on a TIA, talks that had been languishing since 2002. Panama is also taking steps to ensure that its laws reflect international core standards, including by eliminating legal loopholes that allow company-directed unions, and by eliminating prohibitions on the right to collectively bargain in the maritime sector. Further legislative action is now underway in Panama. The administration should hold its ground and insist on movement of each of the various pieces of the trade agenda only as they're ready for action. It's the Republicans who are holding up action on trade issues, not the administration. The approach by Republicans in Congress to hold action hostage has a number of additional detrimental consequences. It minimizes the importance of the South Korea FTA. The EU-Korea agreement goes into effect in July. And unless Republicans stop stalling, our companies will be disadvantaged in that market. It also maximizes partisanship and the polarization that has been endemic in consideration of issues of international trade. And Fred, you kind of referred to that in your introduction. It also distracts from other negotiations where we need to have a full and comprehensive discussion of key issues. This includes the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the WTO Doha round. There needs, and I emphasize this, I met with Pascal Lamy just a week ago or two, there needs to be a renewed effort to understand the importance of the Doha round that was supposed to be a development round and of outstanding issues separating the major trading nations. So let me close with this thought. I believe that when historians look back, they will conclude that U.S. trade policy was too slow to adjust to globalization. But I'm determined to not let what happened in our trade policy towards Japan in the 80s happen to our trade policy with globalization in this decade. At that time, those of us who called for active attention to Japan's unfair trade practices were called proponents of, in quotes, managed trade. We were told that it would all work out, or that Japan was only hurting itself. Years later, a U.S. Treasury Secretary admitted to me that there should have been action, but then it was too late. I think we were right then, and we're right now. The old conventional wisdom about trade policy is outdated, and there is a new model, partly exemplified by changes to the Peru and Korea agreements. It's waiting, the new model, to be seized. Thank you very much.